Welcome back. We're going to pick right up where we left off in the last video because I had to interrupt mid-paragraph because we were running up against the 20-minute mark on the last video. So we go right back to point 78 as we continue with our discussion on the stripping of the mind. And that which perishes is not the dominant portion in us, but the subject one. That which acts the part of the multitude, and it receives death up to this point, namely, until it turns to repentance and confesses its sin. For the Israelites, coming to Moses, say, "We have sinned in that we have spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray therefore for us to the Lord, and let him take away the serpents from us." It is well put here, not "we have sinned because we have spoken against the Lord," but because we were inclined to sin, we have spoken against the Lord. For when the mind sins and departs from virtue, it blames divine things, imputing its own sins to God. How then can there be any remedy for this evil? When another serpent is created, the enemy of the serpent which came to Eve, namely, the word of temperance. For temperance is opposite to pleasure, which is a varied evil, being a varied virtue, and one ready to repel its enemy pleasure. Accordingly, God commands Moses to make the serpent according to temperance, and he says, "Make thyself a serpent, and set it up for a sign." Do you see that Moses makes this serpent for no one else but for himself? For God commands him, "Make it for thyself," in order that you may know that temperance is not the gift of everyone, but only of that man who loves God. And we must consider why Moses makes a brazen serpent, when no command was given to him respecting the material of which it was to be formed. May it not have been for this reason? In the first place, the graces of God are immaterial, being themselves only ideas, and destitute of any distinctive quality. But the graces of mortal men are only beheld in connection with matter. In the second place, not only does Moses love the incorporeal virtues, but our own souls, not being able to put off their bodies, do likewise aim at corporeal virtue. And reason, in accordance with temperance, is likened to the strong and solid substance of brass, inasmuch as it is firm and not easily cut through. And perhaps brass may also have been selected, inasmuch as temperance in the man who loves God is a most honorable thing, and like gold, though it has only a secondary place in a man who has received wisdom and improved in it, and whomsoever the one serpent bites, if he looks upon the brazen serpent, shall live, in which Moses speaks truly. For if the mind that has been bitten by pleasure, that is by the serpent which was sent to Eve, shall have strength to behold the beauty of temperance, that is to say, the serpent made by Moses in a manner affecting the soul, and to behold God himself through the medium of the serpent, it shall live. Only let it see and contemplate it intellectually. Do you not see that wisdom, when dominant, which is Sarah, says, "For whosoever shall hear it shall rejoice with me"? But suppose that any were able to hear that virtue has brought forth happiness, namely, Isaac. Immediately he will sing a congratulatory hymn. As, therefore, it can only be one who has heard the news that can sympathize in one's joy, so also it can only be he who has clearly seen temperance in God who is safe from death. But many souls that have been in love with perseverance and temperance, when removed to a distance from the passions, have nevertheless withstood the power of God, and have undergone a change for the worse, while their Master has made a display of himself and of the work of creation, of himself that he is always immovable, and of the work of creation that it vibrates as if in a scale, and inclines opposite ways at different times. For Moses speaks to the Israelites of God, "Who led ye then through that great and terrible wilderness, where there were who led ye then through that great and terrible wilderness, where there were biting serpents and scorpions and thirst, where there was no water? Who brought forth for thee out of the hard rock a fountain of water? Who fed thee with manna in the desert, which thy fathers knew not?" Do you not see that not only did the soul, while longing for the passions which prevailed in Egypt, fall under the power of the serpents, but that also, while it was in the wilderness, it was bitten by pleasure, that affection of varied and serpent-like appearance? And the work of pleasure has received a most appropriate name, for it is called a biting. Moreover, not only they who were in the desert were bitten by serpents, but also they who were scattered abroad. For I also, often having left the men who were my kinsmen and my friends and my country, and having gone into the desert, in order that I might perceive some of those things which are worthy of being beheld, have profited nothing. But my mind, being separated from me, or being bitten by passion, has withdrawn towards the things opposite to them. And there are times when in the midst of a multitude, composed of infinite numbers of men, I can bring my mind into solitude, God having scattered from me the crowd which perplexes my soul, and having taught me that it is not the difference of place that is the cause of good and evil, but rather God, who moves and drives this vehicle of the soul wherever he pleases. Moreover, the soul falls in with a scorpion, that is to say, with dispersion in the wilderness, and the thirst, which is that of the passions, seizes on it until God sends forth upon it the stream of his own accurate wisdom, and causes the changed soul to drink of unchangeable health. For the abrupt rock is the wisdom of God, which being both sublime and the first of things he quarried out of his own powers, and of it he gives drink to the souls that love God. And they, when they have drunk, are also filled with the most universal manna. For manna is called something which is the primary genus of everything. But the most universal of all things is God, and in the second place the Word of God. But other things have an existence only in word. But indeed they are at times equivalent to that which has no existence. See now the difference between him who turns to sin in the desert and him who sins in Egypt. For the one is bitten by serpents which cause death, that is to say, by insatiable pleasures which inflict death. But the other, he who meditates in the wilderness, is only bitten by pleasure and driven astray, but is not killed. And the one, indeed, is healed by temperance, which is the brazen serpent which was made by the wise Moses. But the other is supplied by God with a most beautiful draught to drink, namely, wisdom, from the fountain which he himself has brought forth out of his own wisdom. Nor, indeed, does the pleasure which is in the form of a serpent abstain from attacking that most sincere lover of God, Moses. For we read as follows, "If, therefore, they will not obey me, nor listen to my voice, for they will say, God has not been seen by you, what shall I say to them? And the Lord said unto Moses, What is that which is in thy hand? And he said, A rod. And God said, Cast it on the ground. And he cast it on the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses fled from it. And the Lord said unto Moses, Stretch forth thy hand, and take hold of it by the tail. And having stretched forth his hand, he took hold of it by the tail, and it became a rod in his hand. And the Lord said unto him, That they may believe thee. How can any one believe God, if he has learnt that all other things are changed, but that he alone is unchangeable? Therefore, God asks of the wise Moses what there is in the practical life of his soul, for the hand is the symbol of action, and he answers, Instruction, which he calls a rod. On which account Jacob, the supplanter of the passions, says, "For in my staff did I pass over this Jordan." But Jordan, being interpreted, means descent, and of the lower and earthly and perishable nature, vice and passion are component parts, and the mind of the ascetic passes over them in the course of its education, for it is too low a notion to explain his saying literally, as if it meant that he crossed the river, holding his staff in his hand. Well, therefore, does the God-loving Moses answer, for truly the actions of the virtuous man are supported by education as by a rod, tranquilizing the disturbances and agitations of the mind. This rod, when cast away, becomes a serpent, very appropriately, for if the soul casts away instruction, it becomes fond of pleasure instead of being fond of virtue, on which account Moses fled from it. For the man who is fond of virtue does flee from passion and from pleasure. But God did not praise his flight, for it is fitting indeed for your mind, before you are made perfect, to meditate flight and escape from the passions. But Moses, that perfect man, ought rather to persevere in his war against them, and to resist them, and to strive against them. Otherwise, they, relying on their freedom from danger and on their power, will ascend up to the citadel of the soul and take it by storm, and will plunder it entirely like a tyrant. On which account God commanded Moses to take hold of it by the tail, that is to say, let not the hostile and untamable spirit of pleasure terrify you, but with all your power take hold of it, and seize it firmly, and master it, for it will again become a rod instead of a serpent. That is to say, instead of pleasure, it will become instruction in your hand. But it will be in your hand that is in the action of a wise man, which, indeed, is true. But it is impossible to take hold of and to master pleasure, unless the hand be first stretched out, that is to say, unless the soul confesses that all actions and all progress is derived from God, and attributes nothing to himself. Accordingly, he, when he saw this serpent, decided to flee from it. But he prepared another principle, that of temperance, which is the brazen serpent, that whosoever was bitten by pleasure, when he looked on temperance, might live a real life. Such a serpent Jacob boasts that Dan is, and he speaks thus, Dan will judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. And again, let Dan be a serpent in the path, sitting upon the road, biting the heel of the horse, and the rider shall fall backwards, waiting the salvation of the Lord. The fifth son of Leah is Issachar, the legitimate son of Jacob. But if the two sons of Zilpah are counted, he is the seventh. But the fifth son of Jacob is Dan, the son of Bilhah, the handmaid of Rachel. And the cause of this we will investigate in the proper place. But concerning Dan we must examine further now. The soul produces two kinds, the one divine and the other perishable. That which is the better kind it has already conceived, and ends in it. For when the soul was able to confess to God and to yield everything to him, it was not after that capable of receiving any more valuable possession. On this account she ceased to bring forth, after she had borne Judah, the emblem of the disposition of confessing. And now she begins to form the mortal race. Now the mortal race subsists by imbibing. For, like a foundation, the sense of taste is the cause of the duration of animals. But the name Bilhah, being interpreted, means imbibing. From her was born Dan, which name being interpreted means judgment. For this kind distinguishes between and separates immortal from mortal things. Therefore he prays that he may become a workman of temperance. But he will not pray for Judah, for Judah already has the capacity of praying to and pleasing God. Therefore, let Dan, says he, be a serpent in the path. One path is the soul. For as in the roads one may behold a great variety of living beings, inanimate and animate, irrational and rational, good and bad, slaves and free, young and old, male and female, strangers and natural citizens, sick and healthy, mutilated and perfect, so also in the soul there are motions inanimate, and imperfect, and diseased, and slavish, and female, and innumerable others of the class of evils. And on the other hand, there are motions which are living, and perfect, and masculine, and free, and healthy, and ripe, and virtuous, and genuine, and really legitimate. Let then the principle of temperance be a serpent in the soul, which makes its advance through all the circumstances of life, and let it sit in the path. But what is the meaning of this expression? The field of virtue is not trodden down, for they are few who walk along it, but that of vice is trodden and worn. And he recommends him here to occupy and to fill with ambush and stratagem the well-trodden path of passion and vice, in which the thoughts which are deserters from virtue pass their life. Biting the heel of the horse. Very consistently, the disposition which shakes the stability of the created and perishable being is called the supplanter, and the passions are compared to a horse. For passion has 4 legs as a horse has, and is an impetuous beast, and full of insolence, and by nature a most restive animal. But the reasoning of temperance is wont to bite, and to wound, and to destroy passion. Therefore, passion having been tripped up, and having fallen, the horseman will fall backwards. We must comprehend that the horseman who has mounted upon the passions is the mind, who falls from the passions when they are reasoned upon closely, and so are supplanted. And it is well figured that the soul does not fall forward, for it must not go before the passions, but rather advance behind them, and behave with moderation. And there is sound learning in what he says here. If the mind, though desirous to act unjustly, comes too late and falls backward, it will not act unjustly. But if, when it is moved onwards to some irrational passion, it does not run forward but remains behind, it will then receive freedom from the dominion of the passions, which is a most excellent thing. On which account Moses, approving of this backward fall from off the vices, adds further, waiting for the salvation of the Lord. For in good truth, he who falls from the passions is saved by God, and remains safe after their operation. May my soul meet with such a fall as this, and may it never afterwards remount upon that horse-like and restive passion, in order that it may await the salvation of God and attain to happiness. To be continued in the next video.